once you entered through that gate, effectively it was a death sentence, because rarely did anyone leave Stutthof alive. They were worked to death or put to death one way or another. Some people reached a stage where they were literally walking skeletons. Some of them could no longer walk but shuffled on their knees. And there were a very, very small number of people who felt they couldn't take any more punishment. And although it was forbidden to do so, they began shuffling their way towards the high voltage fence to try and electrocute themselves to end their suffering. My name is Manfred Goldberg. I am a Holocaust survivor who was born in April 1930.
Testimony 360 is a learning experience that allows students to engage directly with Holocaust survivor testimony and explore the sites of the Holocaust through virtual reality.
A few weeks after we arrived, one day we returned from work and the youngsters had gone, all 4 of them. 2 SS men had come into the camp during the day, said they had orders to take these youngsters, and they took them away. That's all we found out. And life was so brutal that the next morning, my mother, who was truly heartbroken at the loss of her little boy, I had also grown very close to him because of more than a year of looking after him while my mother was at work in the previous camp. Both of us were pretty shattered, but the next morning we had to line up, shout out our number, line up and go to work as though nothing untoward had happened. We marched escorted by these SS guards. Eventually we saw a tank column coming towards us.
That's staggering.
As the train stopped, the doors to our wagons were unlocked and opened. We had no idea where we had been taken.
It's just invaluable. There's nothing better. There's nothing better than hearing testimony firsthand from a survivor.
She managed to speak to the passport officer of the British Embassy or British Consulate in Berlin. The gentleman who she met was so emotionally struck by her sort of heartbreaking story that she had this dilemma. Her husband was being sent to a concentration camp, had done nothing wrong unless he could show a visa. He was so moved that he wrote out a visa entitling my father to enter the UK. There and then, she walked out with the visa for him in her hand. She had no idea who this gentleman was. She kept saying, "I met an angel today." And we have since found out that this gentleman truly was an angel. His name was Frank Foley, who was, during those years, a super spy for MI6. This gentleman had saved more than 10,000 Jewish lives. 10,000.
Manfred, when were you liberated?
We were liberated on the 3rd of May, 1945.
What was the reaction of people when you arrived in Britain?
When we got off the train, we had my father's address on a piece of paper. Although neither of us could speak English, I could speak just a handful of English words.
It's an extraordinary thing to see technology like that achieving something so essential and powerful, to build an actual connection with a survivor. And now more than ever, as that group disappear beyond the horizon of history, I had a conversation with somebody on the computer screen. Now, for me as an old person, it feels like magic, but for that to be able to touch the lives of young people is beyond powerful.
Each time I see this image, which I've just looked at, I feel sort of momentarily astounded, close to magic as far as I'm concerned. And you're speaking to someone who many, many years ago went to university and took a degree in electronics. But it was a different ballgame 70 years ago when I took my degree. Trainloads of Jews, when they reached our camp of Stutthof, were taken straight from the train to the gas chamber, and hours later they were dead, being taken to the crematorium for burning. Anyone who was too weak to march at the tempo set by the Nazi guards and began trailing behind was shot. And there and then she was taken, lined up against the wall and shot. And I told you that is how I witnessed my first violent death, because that was their way of terrorizing us into obedience, and they succeeded. I did not initially include it in my talk because I couldn't bear to share this, but I have since decided that I must tell it as it happened. Each day our barge stopped. An SS officer appeared at the top of the barge. There was sort of a narrow gangway going around the top, and the barges were completely open, just the hull of a ship with an open floor inside. And we were sitting crouched on the floor with our legs wide apart so that the next person could sit close to us to get the maximum number of people in. And that's how we had been sitting. We were not allowed to get up. And this SS man at the top would look down. He had selected a number of men, said, "You under my orders, do exactly what I tell you to do." Dragged them up despite their resistance and screams. They went up, they were dragged up to the top deck, where they were no longer in our sight. But within a very short time, we heard a heart-rending scream followed by a splash. That person was thrown on his orders into the sea to drown. Then he came back, selected a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth. And he was not satisfied with his work until he had at least 20, 25 people lost their lives in that indescribably cruel manner. It happened on a daily basis. On day 6, it didn't happen. The tugs uncoupled themselves and went off and didn't come back as they usually did after a fairly short time. We were now drifting, unguarded. And among our group of camp inmates, there were a smallish number of prisoners of war. They had been fed a different diet to the rest of us. These prisoners of war were fed the prescribed international diet. As a result, they were much firmer, much stronger than the rest of us who had been starved for years. And they took the initiative. A group of them clambered onto the top deck, and the message came down that we are actually quite close to shore. I don't know whether they'd left us there close or whether we had drifted in that direction, but they shouted down something which we found hard to believe. They said, "We'll try and get the barge ashore so we can jump off and save ourselves." And apparently they managed to prise loose long floorboards from the top deck and arranged themselves as a sort of a rowing team around the circumference of the barge and began rowing in unison using the floorboards as oars. There was uninterrupted rowing for many hours, right through the rest of the day, into the night, and through most of the night, before we felt a jerk and it had run aground. Of course, there was jubilation. People began clambering up on top deck and jumping into shallow water and then walking to land. Everyone in turn clambered up, except We had been on these barges for 6 days now. During those 6 days, starved as we were at the beginning, we had not been given a scrap of food during the 6 days.
Drink?
No drink. And there were some people there who were so emaciated and in a situation where their hearts were still beating, but their minds were not functioning. They were not thinking human beings any longer, and they just sat there, just not moving, waiting for the end. The fact that people were excitedly clambering up didn't make any impression on them. They just remained seated. So gradually, the majority of people clambered up, jumped, and ran ashore, where these people remained behind on the barge, not aware of anything. When we got ashore, my mother and I jumped. She encouraged me. I was scared, I remember, but she said, "We'll be okay," so I jumped. We had no idea what to do next. It was a very dark night. There was no moon. So while there was a discussion on which way really we should move, the Nazis, the Nazi guards returned. And they, of course, were wild, seeing what we had done. So they split. Some of them got onto the barge, and we could hear incessant shooting. All these poor people who no longer were able to think for themselves and had remained behind were shot. The second lot came ashore and rounded us up before we had a chance to get away. And we thought we would be next. We really thought our last minute had come. But by the time they'd lined us up and had a little conference, daylight was beginning to break, and they told us to march. They marched us into a nearby town called Neustadt. We marched in, stood there for quite a long time, then formed into a column again and marched out. They took us along a road. Again, anyone trailing behind was shot. And while we were marching, quite suddenly, the guards stopped shooting people, turned and ran for their lives. And people began yelling, "Look, we're not guarded. We're free, we must be free." And we noticed that there was a tank column coming towards us. They had recognized that tank column as being Allied tanks.